Hello, my name's Gavin, this is Genre Books. I hadn't planned to do this video today, and unless I get busy with the editing, you will probably be able to tell I was going to be doing a live stream tonight. That's been postponed. So I thought, what else? Greg from Another Bibliophile Reads has a new original tag out, and I will be doing that tag next week. But as I was going through songs, as I was going through music, bands and their history to think of pieces to put into my prompt responses, I thought there are other bands which are not going to be on this list that influenced my reading, or at least I think they influenced my reading. Some of this might be a bit of chicken and egg. I was already a reader by the time I got into popular music, but there have been plenty of times in my life where I have been influenced to try something new, to expand the horizons of what I do read, and lots of this that I'm going to be talking about today happened at a time when I was just growing up anyway. So this may have happened naturally, but I have more than a sneaking suspicion that these bands sent me down particular directions. Some of these artists I still listen to, others I don't. 35 years is a long time to listen to some of these bands. For some of them it's not nearly enough. Band number one, and I was probably 12 or 13 when I first started listening to them, are a band that the subject, the songs, were not always linked to the title. Sometimes they were linked very closely, other times I'm not sure anyone had read the source material, just liked the title and thought it's good. But every time I saw one of those titles, it intrigued me. And these were the days when you would get a full LP album and you would have all the lyrics and you would pore over the lyrics and try to divine what the song was about. And when it was about a book, a novel or a story, I'd want to know more about it, and because I'm a fan, I ought to read some of it. Anyway, the band was Iron Maiden, and I saw Iron Maiden in October 1990 at the Poole Arts Centre. And by this point, I think the album they were touring is probably the last album of theirs that I bought. My tastes were expanding rapidly at the time, but I had been a fan of Iron Maiden forever, as far as I was concerned, probably up to 2 years. I don't listen to their music anymore. Very occasionally I might stick one of the early albums on, but they definitely had an influence on what I read. So I went back through the discography to see if there were points I can figure out I was definitely influenced to go and read something or find out about something or read around a subject, or whether there were any that I completely missed. The first song is one where I now actually own the book, but still haven't read it. I don't think the song bears much resemblance to the book. I suppose I won't know until I actually finally read it. I think I was possibly put off reading the book because a member of my family would constantly listen to the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, The Phantom of the Opera. Nothing kills any kind of artistic feeling than the music of Andrew Lloyd Webber. So The Phantom of the Opera is where we begin. And that was on I think it was on the first album, but on the second album we have the song Murders in the Rue Morgue. This has nothing to do with the Edgar Allan Poe story, but I do remember going and reading the Edgar Allan Poe story and being very confused about how it was so different from the book. I mean, there are murders. It's in Paris. I don't want to spoil the story, but I find it very difficult that this is the interior monologue of the murderer. The next song, I'm not sure relates much to the source material either. It's Children of the Damned, which is the title of one of the 2 movies made as adaptations or loose. The second one certainly a looser continuation of the story of John Wyndham's The Midwich Cuckoos. The child in Children of the Damned has glowy eyes. That is where I think it ends. The song is much more impressionistic and much more sort of apocalyptic than The Midwich Cuckoos comes across. The next one, I suppose I was much more invested in the film rather than the book. It's Where Eagles Dare by Alistair MacLean. Why I was listening to heavy metal about World War II missions, I'm not entirely sure, but there we are. On either the same album, possibly the following album, is a song called To Tame a Land. They had, I think, asked permission of Frank Herbert to use Dune as a title, and Herbert had steadfastly refused. I'm not sure he was much of a Maiden fan, but someone in Iron Maiden was certainly a Frank Herbert fan, because this is very much about Dune. It's pretty much describing how you're going to survive on Arrakis. And then we come to the biggie. This definitely had an influence, because after listening to the song, I went away and I read the poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. The song is a sort of a big sort of 12-15 minute epic, and uses excerpts from the poem. And it got me reading poetry. So, cheers, Iron Maiden. Just 2 more songs. Both, I think, are on the album Somewhere in Time. Not entirely sure. One of them certainly is. So there is The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. A bit of a mouthful for a song title. And one where I still haven't read the book is Stranger in a Strange Land. I do have a copy. In fact, I've got a copy of both of those titles on my shelves. I think this is one where I only realised after the event that there was a novel of the same name. I certainly knew that The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner was a piece of literature. There are more rock bands on my little list, but this is probably, I would say the only proper heavy metal band on the list. But there we are. Heavy metal is something which expanded my reading tastes, and in some diverse and surprising directions. Less surprising is the next band, because they were more, I'm not going to say cerebral, I think their drummer was. Rush. I was lucky enough to see Rush as well. This would have been in the 1992 Roll the Bones tour at Wembley, I think. April. And a double luck for me there, because supporting Rush was the band Primus. And I'm not sure there's any literary connections in what they have written, but I love the idea that Primus at that time was supporting Rush, two bands that seemed very similar yet so very different. But back to Rush, they were very hard on their sleeve when it came to their literary allusions. The songs, by and large, were titled in a way that it was unambiguous what they were about. But I want to start with the second album, where they changed drummers and were lucky enough to get the services of Neil Peart, who not only was probably the best drummer ever, but also filled in as writer of all their lyrics. There are two on this second album from Rush which suggested books, one of which suggestions I took up. That comes in a moment, but the first song on the second album is called Anthem. Now this is a bit more of a impressionistic piece, but based on the short story novella Anthem by Ayn Rand. This is an earlier piece by Rand before her ideas were formalized and turned into a bludgeon. At the time, we were listening to a rock story about sort of freedom and self-expression. Wasn't quite such a bad thing. The second song, a much quieter piece later in the album, is called Rivendell. So, imagine a time before the Lord of the Rings movies. Imagine a time after the first flush and success of all of the Lord of the Rings paperbacks in the 60s. And imagine a time where the archetypes of the characters of Lord of the Rings were probably better known through Dungeons and Dragons, which I was probably also playing at the time that I was listening to Rush. Rush would create also their own fantasy stories, and we see part of this on this second album, Fly By Night, and we see it's more pronounced in the follow-up album, Caress of Steel. I don't know whether Neil felt that he wanted to write these books. I'm sort of glad he stuck with the songs instead. I wouldn't mind reading a novelisation of some of their songs now. I think it might be fairly entertaining. But we'll skip along to the following album, 2112, which is a much longer retelling of that same novella by Rand, Anthem. And this is where they started becoming a little bit unstuck, because now that it was much more obvious who they were writing about, they had to address criticism from certain parts of the press that they were writing about Ayn Rand. A lot of water has gone under the bridge since then, and Rand has fallen in and out of favour. I'm going to guess she's in favour at the moment. I do try to know what I'm talking about. I have read Atlas Shrugged. I have read The Fountainhead. Atlas Shrugged is absolutely awful. The Fountainhead, I think I read it when I was a bit younger. And as a novel, it actually works a lot better. I still don't think it's for me. But I don't mind the album from the novella that came well before those novels. So here's a literary allusion where it absolutely didn't influence me. I suppose it influenced me in terms of I went and read it. I still had the presence of mind to realise that Atlas Shrugged is absolute doggerel. On later albums, and I think this is the Farewell to Kings, we have one of my favourites, and back to the Romantic Poets again, back to Coleridge again. Different band, same poet, Xanadu. I absolutely love the song Xanadu. It's not about the roller skating people. It is about Kubla Khan's Pleasure Dome. There is also a song on the same album called Cygnus X1. It's all a bit science fiction, but those literary allusions do keep popping up. The ship on which he is sailing the stars is called the Rocinante. I think that has been used in other science fiction works since then. The first time I came across a ship being called the Rocinante was on a Rush album. 1981's Moving Pictures has their most famous song on it, and their most famous song is called Tom Sawyer. And to be honest, the way they talk about Tom Sawyer is very much the same way they talk about Anthem. Now I'm going to suggest that there is a gulf of difference between Ayn Rand and Mark Twain. I much prefer the Mark Twain song. One of the songs I didn't know at the time was based on a short story, but it was. Red Barchetta I thought was just about driving fast in a car somewhere and getting into a bit of trouble. But it is from a 1973 story by Richard Foster called, I think, A Nice Drive in the Country. And the story is dystopian. I haven't read it yet. Doing this video might prompt me to do so. Also on this album we have another song called The Camera Eye, which, although isn't a title of any particular novel, is definitely about John Dos Passos's USA trilogy, which uses the medium of the camera eye to tell much of its story. And it's not the last time Dos Passos turns up in Rush. We have a song later on an album 2 or 3 albums down the road from this one called The Big Money, which is one of the books of that USA trilogy. But between those two we also have it's more of a title than anything. It's The Body Electric. I don't know whether he is referencing Whitman, whether he is referencing Bradbury referencing Whitman, and to be honest the song is about neither, but good choice of title. Rush was a lot more nerdy. It was unabashedly so as well, and probably did make me want to read more to understand the songs. So thank you, Rush. And that is a band I still do listen to on occasion. One band which I listen to a lot more often has fewer literary references, but they are there. I did not get to see this band. They had split up when I was 4. But I have seen half of them play together. Led Zeppelin. So I saw Page and Plant when they had an album when they were at Glastonbury, and I watched it, and as expected they did play some Led Zeppelin songs. So I'm sort of counting that. The references here are much more abstract. Sometimes in a song a few lines are dropped in which definitely relate to a novel. Other times a song is named after a book and has absolutely nothing to do with it. But it's fun to try and spot the bits, and I'm sure I probably have missed a couple along the way. But from the song Ramble On, which is Led Zeppelin 3, I think, there are references in the last verse to Lord of the Rings. On Led Zeppelin 4, or Untitled, or whatever you want to call it, Man Carrying Sticks, we have the Battle of Evermore. Now the Battle of Evermore I don't think is in Lord of the Rings, but it is based on the Battle of Pelennor Fields, and talks about Sauron, talks about Aragorn, and references the Ringwraiths. On that same album we have Misty Mountain Hop, which is absolutely nothing to do with the Misty Mountains. from Middle Earth, but there it is in the title. Later in their catalogue, and I think this is probably on Coda, the album that came out after John Bonham had died, there's a song called Poor Tom. Now, okay, this might even be a coincidence. It's certainly not about the character from King Lear. And finally, one that absolutely can't be about the source material, if nothing else, that it's an instrumental. But John Bonham's drum solo, the first of his drum solos recorded and released on an album, is called Moby Dick. So there you go. Melville's cool, kids. So Zeppelin is much more on the sort of the fantasy side of things, and I think at the time I was listening to them, I was getting more into fantasy. Bit of Tolkien, David Eddings, Stephen Donaldson's Mordaunt's Need, etc., etc. Again, what is influencing what? Did I end up listening to some of these bands because I knew there were these literary references? I know that sometimes I was using the band's literary references to advise me on what I might want to be reading. If I'd had the internet, I would have found a lot of these connections out a lot quicker. The fourth band I want to talk about, and the last two bands I think I'm only going to talk about very briefly, because certainly in the case of the Velvet Underground, there are not a lot of songs specifically about books or where those literary references are on the surface. And where there is, with Venus and Furs, I've not read the book. But I think at this time I was beginning to perhaps leave some of the science fiction and the fantasy and look more at literary fiction, and I was certainly getting into the beats, and that felt part of that counter-cultural feeling, which probably was not by the time I was listening and reading counter-cultural anymore. But there is elements of William S. Burroughs, there are elements of Hubert Selby, there is a bit of Jean Genet, there is a bit of that sort of seedier side of things that comes through the Velvet Underground. And I have seen the Velvet Underground as well. Obviously they had reformed, obviously there was no Nico, but I've seen the Velvet Underground. I haven't seen the final act I want to talk about, and that's the Divine Comedy. I love the Divine Comedy. Obviously there are literary references abound here, not least in the name of the band itself. Band, the man, whichever way you want to view it. And although there are literary references in some of the songs, you don't have a song called Our Mutual Friend by accident. You certainly don't have one called Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World by accident. But the song I want to talk about definitely influenced me. On the album Promenade from, I'm going to say 1994, The Book Lovers. The song is just a list of authors and some comedy responses where they all say hello to you, or hello or something. I absolutely love this song, and there were authors on there I had not heard of, so that got me interested. And by this point I'm now taking my A-level in English literature, so these things were all combining together. And what I did not know until I saw someone's BookTube video on reading out a piece of poetry, the chorus of this song is actually from a poem as well. Happy the man, and happy he alone, who in all honesty can call today his own, he who have life and strength enough to say, yesterday's dead and gone, I want to live today. Okay, that doesn't quite capture the spirit of me talking about bands I used to listen to 35 years ago. But I probably felt it at the time. There were plenty of other bands where they had one or two songs which made me take an interest in a piece of literature. Sometimes I was reading some literature and realised, oh, there is a band that's done something on this. Killing an Arab by The Cure, which is Albert Camus. The White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane, obviously Alice in Wonderland. The David Bowie album, which is pretty much about 1984. And this is before you get into prog. Okay, maybe I've skirted on prog with citing Rush, but in prog rock, things go very literary. Marillion, after all, is short for Silmarillion, the Tolkien work, and they have, I think, a song or a whole album called Grendel. So it's about Beowulf. Close to the Edge by Yes is Siddhartha. Obviously, talking Hermann Hesse, you've got Steppenwolf. There's Tales of Mystery and Imagination by the Alan Parsons Project. You've got an actual collaboration between Hawkwind and Michael Moorcock. You have Jeff Wayne's musical version of The War of the Worlds. And not to be outdone, you have Rick Wakeman's Journey to the Centre of the Earth. Some of these things I love, some of these things I will never listen to. But there is definitely another video that could be made just on prog bands. But I will leave it there and ask anyone to leave their suggestions, reminiscences, disagreements, violent disagreements in the comments below. And until next time, bye.